Daniel Carter only wanted a quiet dinner with his 8-year-old daughter inside the very restaurant he had built with his own hands. The hostess glanced at his faded work clothes and said, there were no tables, though several sat empty. When Daniel pointed to them, she leaned in and hissed, "Who do you even think you are? You don't belong in a place like this. Get out." Minutes later, she seated a wealthy family at one of those same tables without checking a single reservation. Daniel didn't argue. He simply watched, made one quiet phone call, and froze the entire restaurant. Why would the man who owned this building choose to fire every employee working that night? Before we get into what happened next, if stories about quiet dignity and long overdue justice speak to you, hit subscribe now, because this channel is built around moments like the one you're about to see. Daniel Carter, a 43-year-old black single father, had learned a long time ago that grief does not ask permission before it changes a man's entire life, rearranging what matters without ever asking first. He was raising his daughter Emma alone in Chicago, and most days he could go hours without thinking about the year his wife Sarah was diagnosed with cancer. But some memories never fully let go of a person, and the sound of Emma's laughter, so much like her mother's, pulled him back every single time, softly and without warning, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. He kept a photo of Sarah folded in his wallet, worn soft at the corners, from years of being taken out and put back. The illness had moved faster than either of them expected, and by the end, Sarah spent most of her days in a hospital bed set up in their living room, too weak to do much more than watch Emma color at the kitchen table a few feet away. Even then, she talked about the restaurant almost every day, describing the exact color she wanted painted on the walls and the kind of chairs she wanted people to sink into. After a long shift, Daniel used to sit beside her bed and let her describe it in detail, understanding even then that the dream mattered more to her than any medicine the doctors could offer. On one of her last clear afternoons, Sarah made him promise something specific, something he had carried into every decision he made about the business ever since. She told him the day would come when he would have to choose between what was easy and what was right. Probably more than once, and that whenever it arrived, she wanted him to remember exactly how it had felt when the two of them shared one plate at a second-hand table, wondering if things would ever get easier. He promised her he would remember. Hunt had no idea back then just how literally that promise would come due one evening years later. After Sarah passed away, Daniel worked 3 jobs just to keep their small apartment and put food on the table. He spent his mornings on a construction site, his evenings delivering food across the city, and the hours after midnight cleaning office buildings that emptied out long before he arrived. Some nights he had only enough money to buy a single meal from a corner diner near their apartment. He would set the plate in front of Emma, tell her he had already eaten, and go to bed hungry so his daughter would never know the difference. He never once let her see him count coins on the kitchen table late at night. Emma was too young in those years to remember most of it clearly, but she remembered enough. She remembered her father's boots by the door, always caked in something different depending on the season, and the particular way he smelled of diesel and dish soap when he came home just in time to walk her to school. She grew into a serious, watchful child, the kind who noticed things other children her age tended to overlook, quick to catch when an adult's tone did not quite match their words. It was a trait that would later make her 3 careful questions inside Carter's grill land with far more weight than a typical 8-year-old's curiosity. What kept him moving through those years was the promise he had made to Sarah before she died. She had always dreamed of opening a small family restaurant, a place where nobody would ever be judged by the color of their skin, the clothes on their back, or the amount of money in their wallet. A restaurant should feel like a second kitchen table for anyone who walks through the door. She used to say, a place where being tired or broke or unsure of yourself never has to be hidden. She made Daniel swear that no matter how long it took, he would build that place for her one day, even if she was no longer there to see it. It took years of saving every spare dollar, but Daniel eventually bought an old food truck and began serving simple meals to construction workers and night shift employees who reminded him of himself. People who rarely had time to sit down for a proper meal between one job and the next. Sarah's favorite word for any place that felt like home had been welcome, and so he painted that single word across the side of the truck himself over 2 long weekends with paint borrowed from a coworker. The regulars from those early years still talked about how Daniel used to remember exactly how everyone liked their coffee and how he would quietly slip an extra roll into the bag of anyone who looked like they had gone without lunch that day. Within a few years, that single truck grew into a diner, and through steady work and careful decisions, Daniel expanded the diner into Carter's Grill, a small restaurant chain now operating 3 locations across Chicago, known throughout the city for both its food and its values. Regular customers often said the same thing about the place, that walking in felt less like visiting a business and more like being welcomed into someone's home. Despite being the founder, Daniel rarely let new employees recognize him. He kept no portraits of himself in any location, and he often visited his own restaurants in plain clothing just to see how an ordinary customer was actually treated when nobody suspected who was watching. Over time, this had become something private between Daniel and Emma, almost like a game, only the two of them understood, complete with a small wink right before they walked through any door. Whenever they visited a location where the staff did not know his face, Emma knew without being told that she had to keep her father's secret. That secrecy had never troubled her before, because in every previous visit the two of them had simply been treated the same as anyone else. To her, it had always felt like a small adventure rather than a burden. In recent weeks, the downtown location had started receiving a troubling pattern of complaints. Customers reported being kept waiting near the entrance for long stretches even when tables inside sat empty, and nearly all of them were working-class customers, elderly patrons, or families who clearly did not have much money to spend. The manager overseeing that location, Brandon Hayes, insisted these were simple misunderstandings during busy dinner rushes, and for weeks his explanations had been convincing enough that Daniel let the matter rest. Daniel had read through the complaint file more than once at his kitchen table after Emma had gone to bed, laying the printed pages side by side and noticing the same details repeating themselves in different handwriting. A retired teacher wrote that she had been told the dining room was at capacity only to watch 2 parties arrive after her and get seated within minutes. A young father wrote something almost identical about a birthday dinner for his son. Individually, each complaint sounded like an unlucky night. Stacked together on his kitchen table, they read like a pattern no one at the location wanted him to notice. When he raised the numbers with Brandon over the phone, Brandon answered every question smoothly, always with a reasonable-sounding explanation ready before Daniel had even finished asking, the kind of fluency that eventually became its own small warning sign. Brandon had once been fired from a previous restaurant job after a location he managed missed its monthly revenue targets, and that experience had left a permanent mark on how he approached his work. He had a young family of his own to support, and the memory of explaining that firing to his wife over a kitchen table, not unlike the one Daniel and Emma once shared a single plate at, had stayed with him far longer than the job itself. He had promised himself he would never again watch a corporate office decide his fate over a spreadsheet. Without ever telling Daniel directly, Brandon had built a quiet internal system that sorted every guest into one of 3 tiers on the hostess tablet labeled simply P1, P2, and P3. He described it to his staff as a guest value program, a modern loyalty tool used at high-performing restaurants across the city, and most of the newer employees genuinely believed that was exactly what it was. Something closer to a rewards card than a filter. Only Brandon and Kelsey fully understood what those letters actually decided, and Brandon had convinced himself more than once that he was protecting jobs rather than harming anyone. Daniel did not fully believe Brandon's explanations, and something about the pattern felt too consistent to be accidental. Rather than confront Brandon with accusations, he could not yet prove he decided to see the situation with his own eyes, the way he had done many times before at other locations. I had learned long ago that numbers on a report could hide almost anything, but a dining room could not lie to a person willing to sit and watch it. That afternoon, Daniel picked up Emma from school after finishing a volunteer shift at a community construction project. His company had sponsored one of several efforts he funded quietly around the city without ever putting his name on a plaque or a press release. The crew that day had been repairing a playground fence in a neighborhood not far from where he and Sarah once rented their first apartment. And something about swinging a hammer in that particular part of the city always left him thinking about the years before any of this existed. I was still wearing a faded work shirt covered in dust and an old pair of boots that had clearly seen years of use. Before they walked through the doors of Carter's Grill, he knelt down and reminded Emma of their familiar rule. Today, just like always, they were simply 2 ordinary customers. Emma nodded seriously the way she always did, as if accepting an important assignment, and slipped her small hand into his the way she had at every one of these visits since she was old enough to remember them. The hostess working the front desk that evening was a young woman named Kelsey Monroe, employed at the restaurant for about 6 months. She had taken the job while finishing community college classes at night, and by most accounts, she was polite and hardworking, the kind of employee Brandon had specifically chosen to train because she rarely questioned instructions from someone she considered more experienced than herself. She looked Daniel up and down, took in his worn clothing, and flatly announced that the restaurant was full. Daniel gestured toward several visibly empty tables, but Kelsey insisted every one of them had already been reserved. What she did not question in that moment was the tier system Brandon had trained her on during her very first week. She had genuinely believed that sorting guests by appearance was simply a professional way of managing a busy dining room, not something anyone should be ashamed of. Daniel asked evenly whether he and his daughter might wait near the entrance until something opened up. Kelsey's expression barely changed. She leaned toward him and said in a tone that had nothing professional left in it that he did not belong in a place like this, and that he needed to leave before she had someone remove him. Before Daniel could respond, a well-dressed couple walked through the door with their 2 children close behind. Kelsey did not ask for their name, and she did not check any list at all. Her posture shifted instantly. A warm, practiced smile appeared, and she guided the family straight toward one of the very tables she had just claimed was unavailable. The couple never once glanced toward the 2 people standing quietly near the entrance, entirely unaware that their easy welcome had just confirmed something Daniel had suspected since the moment he walked in. Emma watched the exchange in confused silence, standing close beside her father. After a moment, she tugged gently on his sleeve. "Dad, why did they get to go in and we didn't?" The question struck Daniel harder than he expected. It was not simply the unfairness of the moment, but the realization that his own daughter, even knowing this restaurant belonged to her father, had chosen to honor their private promise of silence rather than expose the truth on the spot. Daniel understood that Emma was experiencing exactly the kind of judgment he had once sworn no one would ever feel inside the walls of Carter's Grill. Near the kitchen entrance, a longtime server named Miguel Torres caught sight of Daniel and immediately recognized him despite the plain clothing. Miguel had worked at the downtown location for several years and knew Daniel's face well from company visits long before Brandon had taken over. He remembered, too, a much friendlier version of this restaurant, one where the manager before Brandon used to greet regulars by name and comp a coffee for anyone having a hard week without needing permission. He took a step forward, clearly intending to intervene, but Brandon quickly pulled him aside and ordered him under his breath not to interfere with anything happening near the front of the house that evening. Miguel was the only employee who had once raised concerns about the tier system, only to be told it came directly from corporate leadership. Without solid proof to challenge that claim, he had reluctantly let the matter go, though the discomfort had never fully left him. Standing near the entrance with his daughter's hand in his, Daniel faced a decision that felt heavier than any business choice he had made in years. He could reveal his identity immediately, or he could stay a little longer and see exactly how deep this problem ran. He thought about all the mornings he had woken up exhausted on a job site, promising himself that if he ever built something of his own, it would never treat a tired, worn-out person the way he had so often been treated back then. Standing here now, watching his own restaurant betray that promise in real time, felt like watching a stranger wearing his own name. After a moment, he chose to keep watching, crouching down to tell Emma that sometimes a person needed to see the full truth of a broken system before they could ever hope to fix it. Emma nodded slowly, still confused, but trusting her father, completely unaware of just how much more they were both about to witness before the night was over. Less than half an hour into their wait, Daniel had already seen enough to know this was not one hostess having a bad night. He kept his posture relaxed and his voice low whenever he spoke to Emma, the same discipline he had trained into himself over years of these unannounced visits. But underneath that calm, something had already begun to shift. What he was watching no longer felt like an isolated mistake made by one tired employee. It felt deliberate, far too smooth to be an accident. More than once he felt the urge to simply announce who he was and end the discomfort both for Emma's sake and his own, but he had learned that a manager caught off guard would scramble to fix only what he happened to witness, patching one visible crack while leaving the rest of the structure untouched. If he wanted to understand how deep this ran, he needed to see it play out a while longer, uncomfortable as that choice was to keep making with his daughter beside him. The discomfort he felt standing near that entrance, he reminded himself, was nothing compared to what the families turned away. On other nights, must have felt walking back out the door with no one watching who could do anything about it. Near the coat check, an elderly black woman using a wooden cane made her way slowly through the door, clearly tired, moving carefully across the polished floor as though every step required its own small effort. When she asked how long the wait might be, Kelsey told her it would be a while, gesturing vaguely toward the same open tables Daniel had pointed out earlier. "Those tables are being held for the right kind of guests tonight," Kelsey said, without a trace of hesitation, in the same flat tone she had used on everyone else that evening. The elderly woman simply nodded and lowered herself onto a bench near the wall, the posture of someone who had heard some version of that sentence many times before in many other places. Daniel watched her fold her hands in her lap and stare straight ahead, and something tightened in his chest at how easily she had accepted it, as though fighting back had stopped feeling like an option a long time ago. He found himself wondering how many other nights like this one she had already lived through in rooms that looked nothing like his own. He thought too of Sarah, and of the exact words she had used the night she first described her dream of this restaurant, sitting up in that hospital bed with more energy in her voice than her body had left to spare. She had said that the true test of any business built on hospitality was not how it treated the customer who could afford anything on the menu, but how it treated the one who could barely afford a glass of water. Watching this woman settle onto a bench without a fight felt like a betrayal of that promise playing out in real time, in a building that carried his own family's name above the door. He thought about the promise he had made at Sarah's bedside, the one about choosing right over easy, and understood that tonight was already asking him to keep it. A few minutes later, while pretending to check the coat rack for an empty hook, Daniel glanced down at the tablet resting beside Kelsey's station. A printed sheet sat next to it marked with small letters beside each name on the list. P1 appeared next to guests who arrived in expensive clothing or gave reservations under recognizable last names. P3 sat beside entries for guests who arrived on foot in work uniforms or with young children in tow, quietly deciding how long they would be made to wait before anyone even looked their way. Near the bottom, in smaller handwriting, someone had jotted a rough estimate of expected spending beside a few of the evening's larger parties, as though guests had been appraised the moment they stepped through the door. The paper itself looked ordinary, tucked between a stack of blank order pads and a half-empty bottle of hand sanitizer, the kind of thing anyone might walk past 100 times without a second glance. Daniel studied it for only a few seconds, but those seconds told him more than an entire week of reading Brandon's reports ever could. Every complaint filed over the past month suddenly made painful sense. Miguel passed close enough to see Daniel looking at the sheet, and for reasons he could not fully explain even to himself, he lifted his phone and photographed it before continuing on with his tray, tucking the phone back into his apron pocket with his heart pounding hard enough that he was certain someone would notice. He had thought about doing something like this for months. Ever since the first time Brandon brushed off his concerns, but he had always talked himself out of it by the time his shift ended. Tonight, watching the same man he recognized from company visits standing quietly near the door, something in him finally refused to let the moment pass unrecorded. It was into this atmosphere that a woman named Rachel Bennett walked through the front doors holding the hands of her 2 young children, her scrubs still visible beneath an unzipped jacket from a long shift at the hospital. She looked worn down, in a way that went beyond a single hard day, the kind of tiredness that settles into a person's shoulders after months of doing everything alone. Since her husband had taken a job 2 states away that never seemed to send enough money home, she simply wanted to buy her children a warm dinner before heading home to get them ready for school the next morning. One small, ordinary comfort at the end of an exhausting week. Rachel approached the hostess stand and asked hopefully whether her 2 children might share a single entree between them, explaining that she did not have quite enough money that evening for 2 separate meals, and that splitting one plate would be more than enough to fill their stomachs. "I'm sorry, but we don't allow shared entrees here," Kelsey said flatly. "I've eaten here before with my kids. We've always been able to split a plate." "Policy must have changed then." "I can't make an exception tonight." Rachel glanced down at her children, then back at Kelsey, her voice softening even further as though a gentler tone might change the answer. "It's just one plate. They're small. They won't even finish it between the 2 of them." Kelsey did not look up from her tablet again, and after a moment Rachel understood that no amount of asking nicely was going to change anything. Brandon, drifting closer, added his own instruction before Rachel could respond. telling a nearby security guard that if the family could not afford a full meal for each person, they should be shown to the exit, so they would not hold up the waiting area. What neither of them remembered or chose to ignore was that Daniel himself had written the rule allowing children to share meals into every training manual across all 3 locations. It was one of the first policies he had ever put in writing, born directly from the nights he had gone without eating, so Emma never had to. Rachel's face flushed with embarrassment as she apologized and turned to lead her children back toward the door, her hand tightening around each of theirs as though she could shield them from the moment simply by moving faster. Her younger son, no older than 5, glanced longingly at a nearby table where food sat steaming, and in a small voice that carried further than he probably meant it to, he said, "Mommy, I'm really hungry." Rachel knelt down quickly and whispered something to him that Daniel could not quite hear. Something meant only for her son before straightening up again with the practiced composure of a mother who had learned to keep moving, no matter what her own face wanted to do. Emma's grip on her father's hand tightened. She looked up at him. "Dad, we used to share food too. Why won't they let those kids do it?" It was the second question that evening Daniel did not have an easy answer for, and this one struck deeper than the first. He understood with complete certainty that this was no longer a problem. He could pin on one rude employee or one unfortunate misunderstanding. The entire location had quietly turned basic decency into something reserved only for people who could prove at a glance that they had enough money to deserve it. Watching Rachel's shoulders sink as she turned toward the door was the moment something in him finally settled into resolve rather than doubt. He stepped forward and asked a nearby server to bring Rachel and her children back inside. Brandon moved quickly to block his path, stepping directly into it with the confident posture of a man who still had no idea who he was speaking to. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside and let my staff do their jobs. Your staff just told a mother her children couldn't share a plate of food. I'd like to understand why." "That's a business decision, not something I owe an explanation for to a man blocking my entryway." "Then let's talk about that decision somewhere quieter, because I don't think you want this whole room hearing the real reason behind it." Brandon warned him that if he kept causing a disturbance, security would remove both him and his daughter. Daniel studied him for a long moment, aware of just how easily this man had grown used to giving orders inside walls he did not own. Under rules he had no right to invent. Rather than respond to the threat, he turned to face the small crowd of employees gathered near the front and asked one simple question. "Does anyone here actually agree with how this restaurant is treating its customers tonight?" Nobody answered. A few nearby customers had stopped eating altogether, forks resting on the edges of their plates as they watched the scene unfold. One man half rose from his seat as if considering whether to say something, then sat back down when his wife touched his arm and shook her head. Even the strangers in that room seemed to understand without being told that whatever was happening near the hostess stand was bigger than a simple disagreement over a table. Some of the employees lowered their eyes toward the floor. Others glanced sideways at Brandon, waiting for a signal about how they were supposed to respond to a question that clearly had only one honest answer. Not one person stepped forward for Rachel, for the elderly woman still on the bench, or for the man standing quietly with his daughter's hand in his. Emma tugged once more on his sleeve, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, is this what always happens here when we're not looking?" Daniel did not have an easy answer for her, because in that moment, he was no longer certain how long this had been happening or how many families like Rachel's had quietly walked away from his own restaurant, believing they simply were not welcome. He squeezed her hand once, a small promise that he intended to find out. Brandon, growing frustrated, ordered the nearest guard to remove Daniel from the premises. The guard hesitated only briefly before gripping Daniel's arm and beginning to guide him toward the exit in full view of Emma and dozens of other customers. Emma's eyes went wide as she watched the guard's hand close around her father's arm, and for a brief moment, she looked as though she might cry out, her fingers digging into the fabric of his sleeve. Seeing that fear cross his daughter's face settled something firmly in Daniel's chest, replacing whatever patience he had left with quiet, unshakable resolve. If he allowed himself to be physically removed from his own restaurant without a word, Emma would carry a lesson forward from tonight that he never wanted her to learn: the belief that unfairness was simply something people were expected to accept in order to avoid making a scene. That was the moment Miguel finally moved. He set his tray down hard on the nearest empty table, the sound sharp enough to turn several heads, and stepped directly between Daniel and the door, his voice shaking but clear enough for the whole entrance to hear. "Let him go. He's right. We've been doing this for months, and I've got the proof sitting in my pocket right now. The guard froze, uncertain, his hand still loosely around Daniel's arm, glancing between Miguel and Brandon as though waiting for someone to tell him which order to actually obey. Brandon's face went pale as he turned toward Miguel, his mouth opening and closing without finding any words. But before he could recover, Daniel calmly asked the guard to step back, and the young man complied at once, some instinct telling him he had just made a serious mistake. For a brief moment, standing there with Emma's hand still gripping his own and Miguel's confession still hanging in the air, Daniel felt the full weight of everything this night had already cost. Not just to himself, but to Rachel, to the elderly woman on the bench, and to every customer who had walked through these doors in recent weeks believing they simply were not welcome. There was no version of tonight that ended with a quiet apology and a free dessert. Whatever came next needed to match the size of what had actually happened here. Daniel reached for his phone and dialed a number he rarely needed during these visits. When the call connected, he spoke evenly, his voice carrying across the now silent entrance. Freeze every transaction at the downtown location. Preserve tonight's records exactly as they stand and stop seating any new guests until I say otherwise. Servers exchanged confused glances as their handheld devices lit up with a company-wide notice confirming the freeze. A few checked their screens twice as if expecting the message to explain itself, but it offered nothing beyond the instruction and the name of the account that had issued it. Daniel then placed a small silver key engraved with the Carter's Grill logo that appeared on every uniform and every delivery truck across the company gently on the hostess stand in front of Kelsey. Within a minute, Brandon's phone rang. It was the company's operations director calling to confirm, in a voice tight with disbelief, that the man standing at the downtown hostess stand was in fact Daniel Carter, founder and chief executive of the entire company. Brandon lowered the phone slowly, the color already draining from his face. Kelsey did not believe it until Brandon repeated the words out loud for the whole room to hear. A heavy stillness settled over the dining room. The employees who had spent the last half hour deciding who deserved kindness now understood they had spent the evening insulting the very man who owned every table, every plate, and every paycheck inside that building. Brandon tried to shift blame toward Kelsey, insisting he had only been managing the floor. Kelsey pushed back just as quickly, reminding him that every rule she followed had come from his own training. Other employees added their own defenses, each voice louder than the last, the blame moving in circles with nowhere left to land. A busboy near the kitchen door, who had said nothing all evening, finally muttered under his breath that he had told his roommate weeks ago. Something about the seating here felt off, though he had never once said so out loud to anyone who could have done something about it. Daniel said nothing to any of it. He had already seen everything he needed to see, and no amount of scrambling now would undo what his own eyes had witnessed happen to Rachel, to the elderly woman still on the bench, and to his own daughter beside him. He looked around the dining room, slowly taking in the frozen servers, the pale-faced guard still near the door, and Brandon's hands trembling slightly as he searched for some version of events that might still save his job. Nobody in the room seemed to know exactly what would happen next, and for a long moment, nobody dared to ask. Emma stood quietly beside her father, watching the same faces that had looked at them with such open contempt just minutes earlier now flooded with dread. She felt no satisfaction in their fear, only a tired kind of sadness that so many people could know something was wrong and still choose to say nothing until it was far too late to matter. Daniel turned from the small crowd still trading blame and walked toward the door where Rachel remained frozen with her two children close beside her. The guard who had gripped his arm only minutes earlier now stood near the wall with his hands loose at his sides, looking as though he wished he could disappear from the room entirely. Daniel glanced at him once, not with anger, but with something closer to weary understanding, before he asked Rachel gently whether she would let him bring her family back inside for the dinner they had originally come for. Rachel hesitated, then nodded, letting Daniel guide them to an open table near the center of the room. He knelt in front of the two children and told them they could order absolutely anything on the menu. Even the steak, the younger boy asked wide-eyed. Especially the steak, Daniel said, smiling in a way that had nothing to do with running a business and everything to do with a promise he had carried for years. His older sister, who had said almost nothing since they walked back in, tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Can I get the same thing as him? I don't want him to eat alone." Daniel told her that of course she could, that nobody in this restaurant would ever eat alone again if he had anything to say about it, and the girl allowed herself a small, uncertain smile for the first time all evening. Rachel's composure broke and tears slipped down her face as she thanked him, unable to find words large enough for the moment, her hand pressed briefly over her mouth as though trying to hold everything in at once. Emma sat down beside the children without needing to be asked, helping the younger boy sound out unfamiliar words on the menu while his older sister watched with visible relief, the tension of the last half hour slowly draining from her small shoulders. A server, still shaken from everything unfolding around her, brought over a basket of warm bread without being asked, setting it down along with 3 glasses of water. It was a small gesture, but after the hour Rachel had just endured, it felt like the first genuinely kind thing anyone in the building had offered her all evening. She held one of the warm rolls for a moment before breaking it in half for her children, an old habit from years of stretching. Whatever she had, a little further than it was meant to go. Daniel straightened and faced the employees still scattered near the entrance. He told them evenly that many years ago, before this restaurant existed, he and Emma had once shared a single plate of food because there had not been enough money for 2, and that Carter's Grill had been built so families like his own, and families like the one now seated behind him, would never again feel embarrassed simply for walking through a door. Yet tonight, his own staff had judged every customer on nothing more than their clothing, their skin color, and the size of the bill they were expected to pay. He pointed toward the bench near the entrance where the elderly woman had waited and reminded them that every one of those moments had been a choice made by someone standing in that room, and every choice had a name attached to it. Nobody in this building had been forced at gunpoint to tell an elderly woman the empty tables in front of her were somehow already spoken for, or to tell a mother her hungry children could not share a plate. Those had been decisions made one after another by people who had simply decided it was easier to follow a system than to question it. He added more quietly that he did not believe every person in that room had set out to hurt anyone. Some had simply been trained into a habit and never stopped to examine it. Others had noticed something was wrong and talked themselves out of saying so. That distinction mattered to him, he said, but it did not change what happened tonight, and it would not change the decision he was about to make. Brandon stepped forward, his panic shifting into something closer to desperation, and asked Daniel to reconsider before making any decision that could not be undone. I built this system because I was scared of losing everything again. I never meant for it to hurt anyone. You watched a mother get turned away for asking her kids to share a plate. You watched an elderly woman sit on that bench for half an hour while empty tables stayed empty. Tell me again how none of that was meant to hurt anyone. Brandon had no answer, and his silence said more than any excuse could have. Daniel told him without raising his voice that fear of losing a job was never an acceptable reason to build a system that stripped dignity from people who already had so little to spare, and that a man who had once known what it felt like to be judged unfairly by a spreadsheet should have been the last person willing to make someone else feel that way over a Hostess tablet. He added that he understood better than most people in that room what it felt like to worry about providing for a family, but that understanding was exactly why this decision could not be undone. Standing in the center of his own restaurant, Daniel understood he now faced a choice between protecting the location's short-term revenue and protecting the values Sarah had asked him to build this business around in the first place. For him, the answer had never really been in question. He announced loud enough for everyone to hear that the downtown location would close immediately for a full investigation into every complaint filed over recent months, not just the handful that had finally reached his desk tonight. Every employee working that shift without exception would be terminated effective immediately, including management, hosting staff, servers, and security. He made it clear that following orders or simply staying silent did not excuse anyone from the choice they had made about how to treat the people in front of them. Brandon was dismissed for designing the tier system and for hiding complaints from company leadership under labels like unverified. Kelsey was dismissed for lying directly to paying customers and refusing service based on appearance regardless of the training she had received. She started to protest that she had only followed what Brandon taught her, but Daniel reminded her without unkindness that plenty of people in that room had been given the same training and had still found ways to treat customers with basic decency. Training explained where a mistake came from. It did not undo the harm it caused. The remaining staff, including Miguel, were released from that night's shift as well, pending the same independent investigation everyone else would face. Daniel made it clear that any employee who had not directly participated in the discriminatory practices would be permitted to reapply once the investigation concluded, and a mandatory retraining program was complete, though no one would be automatically reinstated simply because they had once worked there. That retraining, he added, would be built from scratch, using this very night as its first case study so that whoever eventually returned to work the floor would understand exactly what the tier system had cost the people who walked through these doors. Miguel opened his mouth as if to protest, then closed it again, understanding the fairness even as it stung. Daniel pulled him aside for a moment before he left and told him privately that what he had done in those final minutes mattered more than he probably realized, but that fairness meant no one walked out of that dining room with an exception carved out on the spot. Not even the one person who had finally spoken up. "I understand," Miguel said quietly. "I'd rather earn it back the right way anyway. Send that photo to the investigation email tonight before you go home. Don't let anyone talk you into deleting it or waiting until morning." Miguel nodded, already pulling out his phone as he walked toward the door, and for the first time in months, the weight he had been carrying in his chest since the day Brandon first dismissed his concerns seemed to lift, even knowing he would be unemployed by morning. Before closing the restaurant, Daniel announced that every customer currently seated would eat free of charge, that refunds would go out to anyone mistreated in recent weeks, and that a new complaint line would replace the one Brandon had quietly buried. He confirmed that a small team from the corporate office was already on its way that same night to begin securing records and interviewing staff so the investigation could start while memories were still fresh rather than months later. He walked to the elderly woman still on the bench and personally seated her at the table nearest the window, pulling out her chair himself and apologizing for a wait she never should have endured. She thanked him softly and told him it had been a long time since anyone in a restaurant had looked her in the eye like that. "A restaurant is never measured by the most expensive dish on its menu," he told the room, his voice steady and carrying to every corner of the quiet dining area. "It's measured by how it treats the person who can't afford to order it." Several weeks later, Carter's Grill reopened its downtown location under an entirely new team. The independent investigation confirmed everything Miguel's photograph had shown, along with the pattern of complaints Brandon had tried to bury. Miguel was reinstated and promoted to general manager, this time with the authority to make sure no employee under his leadership was ever again asked to choose between conscience and a paycheck. When Daniel called to offer him the position, Miguel was quiet for a long moment before answering, admitting he had spent the past few weeks certain he had thrown away years of steady work for nothing. Daniel told him that steady work was exactly why he trusted him with the job now, and that the courage he showed in the final minutes of that night was simply the last piece corporate needed to see. Rachel joined a newly formed community advisory board, and her children had a standing invitation to eat at Carter's Grill anytime they wanted. The elderly woman who had once waited on that bench became a regular at the reopened location, greeted by name the moment she walked through the door, and she made a habit of bringing a different friend from her building, each time telling anyone who would listen that this was the one restaurant in the city that had actually kept its word. Emma asked her father if she could help design the new training materials for hostesses, insisting that a person's first 10 seconds inside a restaurant should never determine whether they felt like they belonged. Daniel agreed, and the two of them spent several evenings at the kitchen table drafting simple rules together, the same table where he had once counted coins long after her bedroom door was closed. The community advisory board Rachel joined met once a month in a back room of the downtown location, reviewing complaint logs and suggesting changes that came from people who actually understood what it felt like to be turned away. Rachel often brought her children along, and more than once the younger boy ordered the steak just to make sure the promise from that first night still held. On the wall of that back room, alongside the meeting schedule, someone had pinned a printed copy of the original complaint file Daniel had once read at his kitchen table, a quiet reminder of exactly why the board existed. A small sign was placed near the entrance, visible to every guest from that day forward, the letters painted by hand, in a steady, unhurried script that looked nothing like the printed signage in every other Carter's Grill location. Daniel had asked a local artist, a regular from the very first food truck days, to hand-paint it, rather than order something printed and generic, and he hung it himself the morning before the reopening, standing back afterward to look at it the way he used to look at the food truck all those years earlier. No one who walks in here is a stranger. No one leaves hungry or ashamed. Daniel never treated that night as a triumph, not even in the days afterward when corporate praised him for acting decisively. He understood only that when a system forces good people into silence while harmful behavior goes unchecked, that system has to be rebuilt from the ground up, no matter how uncomfortable or costly the rebuilding turns out to be. A promise once made has to be checked on and protected again and again, because good intentions left unattended can quietly rot into something unrecognizable, dressed up in language that sounds reasonable enough for almost anyone to follow without question. The story closed with Daniel and Emma seated at the very table where they had first been turned away. The same table where a family unaware of who they were had once sat down without a second thought. The dining room around them had filled again with the ordinary sounds of a restaurant, on a normal evening, dishes clinking, quiet conversation drifting between tables, a server laughing softly at something a regular had said. On the empty chair beside them rested a small photograph of Sarah watching over the moment in the only way she still could. Daniel had kept the promise he made to his wife all those years ago. One meal, one table, and one family at a time. If this story reminded you that quiet dignity can outlast any amount of disrespect, that's exactly the kind of story we tell here every week. Before you go, tell me in the comments about a time someone made you feel welcome when they had every excuse not to. Subscribe and stay close, because the next family fighting to be seen might be one you never forget.